All right. So about a year ago today, give or take a few months, I graduated from The Ohio State University. I had many fantastic experiences and memories from here, of course, some that were less good, but the most significant one that changed my life the most was being diagnosed with autism. And as you can see, about 8 exclamation marks for emphasis. I had suspected that I had it all of my life. There were always things that people pointed out about me that were weird or peculiar, and I sought the paper that said what I was in order to have an explanation for them when comments like that came my way, as to asking why, for example, I liked walking on my toes around houses, or why I would flick my ears or flap my hands, why fluorescent lights or extremely loud sounds would give me migraines that would put me out for nearly a week, why I always seemed to miss something in conversations, or why I'd never be able to make eye contact with people, or why I had such protracted interests in certain things, like astronomy. For example, this is the first 4 images taken by JBST. My grandma made me the shirt. Thank you, Gigi. Astronomy, physics, math, reading, music, and nature. In fact, one story that people love telling me again, and I find it very funny, is when I was traveling with my one roommate to be a groomsman at my other roommate's wedding about 3 summers ago. And because I have such a deep interest in nature, I took about thousands upon thousands of photos of the landscape of Iowa and Illinois and Nebraska, and then like 10 of the wedding. This is not saying I didn't have a good time, or I don't love my roommates very much, or the wedding was not very well photographed. It was. But it's just, that's where my eye went. That's what I've been especially interested in ever since I could think or, be conscious as a person. So when I had this great realization about what I was, and this thing that explained who I was, I went up to my friends, my peers, my colleagues, people I just met, and said, look at this scroll of this thing that I am. And I was expecting a response that would assure them or sort of explain the things that I just mentioned. But I was met with something that I didn't expect and kind of bothered me the more I thought about it. Every time I told someone or talked with people, they said, well, duh. That's a no-brainer. With how weird you act and how different you are from others, why wouldn't you be? And that really bothered me for a while. I thought a lot about it. I didn't ask why people said that, but that was okay. I then started, at the same time this was happening, I started talking to other people that were also autistic in clubs, events, friend groups, all around Ohio State and beyond. And at first, it was fantastic. I noticed that in talking with these people, a lot of the guardrails and barriers and masks that I had put up to sort of protect who I was were starting to come down now that who I was as a person was generally understood by those I was talking with. But I was also realizing something else in the way they talked and the way they were, that a lot of people were sad. They felt very disconnected from the world around them, had trouble making friends, holding down jobs, and I was also very bothered by that. I didn't know what to make of it. I then eventually started looking up statistics and things about the autistic population at large in the US, since I now fit into this group, and I was very disturbed. For example, about 70 to 80% of American autistic adults are unemployed. Of course, being just about to go out in the job market in my senior year, that really scared me a lot. And then something that I think is possibly even worse, that about 50 to 70% of US autistic adults are also comorbid with things like anxiety or depression. And with these statistics, and with what these people were talking about with me, and how all of the people I had talked with before were saying that it was obvious that I had this thing, I started to become very upset, angry, furious, that I had been treated like this by others my entire life. At school, at work, at home, I had to work twice as hard to get half as far. And to people that I just met or people I knew well, that at best I was weird and at worst I was a problem. And then, when I collected all of this together as I was about to graduate, I thought to myself, well, duh, That's a no-brainer. Why would I go to these people and expect an answer that when I showed them this thing, that would protect me from the comments that I had received all of my life? To everyone around me, I was already autistic, but without a name. So I eventually got my degree, I moved out of the SHU, and I felt like I was sort of moving out into a world that was rigged against people like me, with the job issues, the sadness, the malaise, everything. And I wanted an explanation. Why was this the way it was? Why did people like me have to deal with things like this? And is there anything that could be done to reverse this trend and stem the tide? When I moved to grad school for astronomy, I moved down to Nashville, and at my institution, there was thankfully a very good opportunity. As I started joining autistic organizations and things around Middle Tennessee, there was also the Frisch Center for Autism and Innovation. It's run by a combination of autistic and non-autistic people whose goal is to place neurodiverse talent into the workforce. And of course, seeing these group of people that seemed to know what they were doing with their lives, and me not really, I said, why not? I'll go to a few classes, seminars, meetings, and do a few odd jobs and see what I pick up. And eventually, I realized I was learning a lot. One of, if not the primary approach the Frisch Center and organizations like it use to help incorporate autistic people into the work world and to larger life is called the strengths-based approach. This is in contrast to how autism was originally diagnosed and defined in the 40s and 50s by a lot of child psychologists who were trying to group children that were seen as troubling, that they acted strangely, they didn't talk after many years of development, that they had trouble making friends or were antisocial. And they saw autism, when they finally put a name to it, as a deficit. The strengths-based approach flips that on its head, and instead of focusing on what autistic people, at least compared to the average person, is bad at, focuses on what we're good at. Although autism is not a monolith and one autistic person is not like another, these are general things that a lot of us exhibit. For example, we have very, very deep focus, especially on things that I'm interested in, like all the photos of Iowa I took that I showed you all. We also tend to think very differently and non-traditionally compared to people who are neurotypical and can be considered sort of out of the box. Also, we have fantastic attention to detail, especially when it comes, which is especially useful for technical tasks. And also, something that is not talked about as much, but I think is very important, is that many of us have a very strong sense of justice, or have trouble breaking from moral codes, are very honest and very empathic, which runs counter to a lot of stereotypes that in the popular media about autism. The strengths-based approach, of course, seeks to change things as they are. The universal design approach seeks to build things from the ground up to accommodate everyone from the start. Whether you're a child, you're an adult, you have vision trouble, hearing trouble, walking trouble, everything in the kitchen sink. Universal design was formalized around the 40s and 50s, the same time that autism was being diagnosed by psychologists, when architects were realizing that the buildings they were building were not being used by people that had walking trouble, that needed crutches or wheelchairs. So they codified into law and started constructing new buildings with elevators and ramps and railings and sidewalks with curbs, so people that had walking difficulties found it easier to move around. This also very much applies to other differences as well as autism. For example, one thing that is incredibly useful is closed captioning, which is very commonly seen in like movies, on like Netflix if you watch it. Netflix, meetings, wherever you can find them. Because a lot of autistic people have trouble with auditory processing or also following when people move their mouths. So having a text accompaniment is so useful. I've used it a million times. Also, something that I find really cool is a lot of grocery stores and places around the US and the world will set some hours where they have dim lights, dim sounds to better accommodate autistic shoppers. Another thing that I think is also really cool and was actually developed for a broader disability community was working from home. Both of my parents, when I was growing up, had physical disabilities that prevented them from going into work. And of course, their bosses didn't necessarily like that, but they gave them work-from-home policies, and we're fine with that. But then when COVID-19 rolled around, and everyone was at home, they turned those work-from-home policies around and applied it to everyone. And some of them, to this day, still like them. And as I was learning all of these things and interacting with more and more autistic people, I noticed that I was becoming far more confident in myself. I realized that if I didn't need to hide myself, put up guardrails, and mask with here, why should I need to do it anywhere? And not only was I enriching my relationships with all of the autistic people I had met and befriended, but also all of the non-autistic people that I love very dearly, many of which are pictured on the screen. And now, a year later, I'm proud to say that whenever someone says something about me or casts a judgment my way, I don't care. Life is too short, and I don't need to explain myself to other people who don't need an explanation. They have to accept me as I am. And if they don't like it, that's their loss. Of course, something that I think is important for everyone in this room to go out and do in the real world is to try to hold no one that you meet or interact with to any standards, because you may not know that if you do, how you're hurting them or what's going on under the hood. Of course, also for all of the people on the spectrum in the audience that are listening after the fact, find community in other people that are also autistic, because it is extremely helpful in building your confidence and raising you up to be the proper person that you deserve to be. Also, lastly, if anyone comes up to you and points out a reason why you're different or you're weird from what they expect, and they demand an explanation of yourself, never think for a single second that you should give it. And if they don't like who you are or that you didn't tell them what they wanted to hear, then that's their loss. And I think, overall, that's a no-brainer. Duh. Thank you.